Hi, I'm Christopher Rea, and welcome to this brief video lecture introducing the author Dung Kai-cheung. I have also made 3 video lectures about Dung's novel Atlas. Dung is a fantastic author. He's very experimental, very cerebral, very challenging, but definitely underrepresented in English translation. His works are very theoretically informed, partly drawing on his comparative literature background. Dung is sometimes referred to as a Hong Kong writer, and I think this fits in the sense that he often writes about Hong Kong. But I say that he also writes from Hong Kong because while he wants to articulate Hong Kong's uniqueness, he also often uses Hong Kong as a case for a broader exploration, theoretical and otherwise. As we'll see in a moment, many of his literary and theoretical touchstones are international, and I think that what he is doing is trying to put Hong Kong poetics, aesthetics, and experiences within a broader context, so that there's some comparability between them. It is impossible to sum up Dung Kai-cheung's multifaceted literary career in just a few minutes, but I want to talk about a few things. One is how he puts these global and Chinese discourses in conversation with each other, and also how he is drawn to, or has this inclination towards, complexity, multiplicity, and divergence, as well as temporality. So he's very interested in the concept of time and space-time, or chronotopes, and how they're expressed in places like Hong Kong. You'll also discover when you read his works that he does a lot of play with language. He coins new terms. He riffs on existing terms, often in unexpected and very creative ways. So I'll give just a few examples, especially his use of the letter V. I'll also share some further readings. Dung Kai-cheung was born in Hong Kong and did an MA in comparative literature at the University of Hong Kong, writing an MA thesis on Marcel Proust, a very important writer who's a touchstone in some of his works. He started publishing in the 1990s, and he has been tremendously prolific ever since, and garnered a lot of recognition and awards for his writing. And I keep using this word cerebral because I do think that he's very theoretically oriented as a writer, and so his works are often very difficult to categorize. Dung describes himself as a full-time writer but not a professional writer, since he says it's impossible to make a living as a writer in Hong Kong, unless perhaps you write martial arts novels. But this list, which I'm not going to translate here, just gives a sense of the scope of his works and the sheer volume of books that he has produced over the past 30 years. I would highlight in particular the novel Atlas, which is available in English translation, as a standout work that imagines Hong Kong and reimagines Hong Kong through signs, particularly the vehicle of maps, and imaginary maps, real maps, maps that accrete different types of meanings. And he uses the mapping of Hong Kong as a theoretical jumping off point. How do signs gain and accrue meanings? How do they cannibalize the meanings of their predecessors? And how does this apply to the case of Hong Kong? Dung is a scholar of the history and lore of Hong Kong, but he doesn't simply replicate this in his fiction. He mixes in quite a lot of fabulism. We get a lot of fantastical elements mixed into this street level as well as map level readings of Hong Kong. I would consider him to be an unclassifiable and genre-spanning author, but he has been very much embraced by the science fiction community. You can find works of his translated in anthologies of Chinese science fiction. He has also won a Science Fiction Literary Translation Award for the English translation of Atlas. Dung is very much a writer who blends history and fiction, but also sees them as distinct. And he once commented at a public lecture that history is not fiction, nor fiction history. The two are not the same thing. Otherwise, we would not need 2 different words, 2 different notions, so it's dangerous to confuse them. Yet history and fiction are closely related. Sometimes we need to defend history from fictions, like the fiction that the Holocaust didn't exist, but we also can use history as a jumping off point for all types of creation. Put another way, when facts are reliable, we need to defend history from fiction, but when the facts are not so reliable or are subject to debate, then we need interpretation. And once you get into the realm of interpretation, you are de facto inventing things. So invention is not the same thing as fiction and is not the same thing as falsehood. And so we need to become acute readers and very sensitive readers in order to determine their differences. Atlas is the first work in a so-called V-City series focused on this fictional city of Victoria. And Atlas, you'll note if you read it, is divided into a few big sections and then many different small chapters that almost read like essays. And some of the other works in the series are similar, like Catalog, for example, has 99 different entries within it. They're almost like individual vignettes. The catalog was written in the late 90s, and some selections have been translated in this anthology, published around the 20th anniversary of the Hong Kong handover. One of Dung's more recent works available in translation is also very interested in the interplay between personal experience, history, and fiction. This is the history of the adventures of Vivi and Vera. Vivi and Vera are Deng's translations of two names that appear in the title of the original Chinese work. Deng's novel is inspired by a late Ming encyclopedia that was radically original in its representation of modern scientific practices and also its illustrations of those practices. Dung Kai-cheung's work, too, also carries illustrations. To say that Dung Kai-cheung is an ambitious writer would be an understatement. He has had many multi-volume projects, including the Natural History series, which is called a trilogy, although it really has 4 volumes in it, and a Spiritual History trilogy. The Spiritual History trilogy also has a touchstone. It was partly inspired by Soseki Natsume's Kokoro from 1914, another much shorter 3-part work. Deng's literary works have also appeared on the stage and been optioned for film. I want to give just a few examples that I think are illustrative of Dung Kai-cheung's literary sensibilities, which again are quite complex, and so I risk oversimplifying them in these brief remarks. But one of the things that I think he's doing is putting Chinese and specifically Hong Kong or Cantonese intellectual and cultural histories in conversation with global intellectual histories. One obvious example, Umberto Eco, the semiotic theorist and novelist, wrote a best-selling mystery novel called The Name of the Rose. And Dung Kai-cheung comes back with The Rose of the Name. The French novelist Balzac wrote a series of fictional works that were later dubbed the human comedy. Dung Kai-cheung recently wrote the post-human comedy. I mentioned that Dung Kai-cheung is interested in time and how people perceive and experience it. Stephen Hawking wrote a famous book about a brief history of time. Dung Kai-cheung wrote Histories of Time, The Luster of Mute Porcelain, whose title could also be translated as A Complex History of Time. The Chinese title of Hawking's work is often translated as 时间简史, kind of like a simplified history of time, like simplified Chinese characters. And Dung Kai-cheung's work is called 时间繁史, so a complex history of time. So there's obviously a response here. When people talk about literary influence, they can often overstate the influence and suggest that the author who has been influenced is not doing anything original. And I would say that Dung Kai-cheung's influences are many, his touchstones are many, but he is also a radically original writer. And so just to give one example of a motif that comes up again and again in his works, the letter V. In Atlas, we are writing about the city of Victoria, this fictional imaginary city. We have the characters Vivi and Vera in the history of the adventures of Vivi and Vera, and then Visible Cities is the title of another of Deng's works. And if you go through Dung Kai-cheung's different literary works, it is almost like he is constructing a literary V city. We have the V-cheng, or Victoria, city that is invoked in Atlas and other works, and in the V-City series. We have the character Venus, who is mentioned. We have Vivi and Vera, as I said before, Visible Cities. In one novel, he has several characters named Virginia. You'll note that in this list, there are a lot of female names, and I think that there are other female associations and motifs that appear in Dung Kai-cheung's works, in addition to notions like variation, variance, and vignettes. To give just one extended example from Histories of Time, that 2-part novel, we have a character named Virginia Anderson, who is a Eurasian character, and she, along with another character called the Dictator, co-author a novel within this novel called Virginia's Heartbeat. And within that novel, we get Virginia the robot librarian, who is living in a post-apocalyptic V city. There's also another fictional character named Virginia in another story within the novel of Histories of Time. So there's a lot of compounding and multiplying going on, even just with this one motif of the V. In the scholar Wu Meng's recent PhD dissertation, she points out that in both Stephen Hawking's work, A Brief History of Time, and in several of Dung Kai-cheung's works, there's this interest in time and representing time through inverted V's that represent either a double light cone or an hourglass. And Dung Kai-cheung doesn't just double V's, he also doubles bodies and motifs and places. We might see a lot of Hong Kong reflected in that V city. I would even argue that time is an obsession for Dung Kai-cheung. I mentioned earlier that he wrote his MA thesis about Marcel Proust, and Proust is known for doing one of the most obsessive, extended explorations of how human beings experience time. If you look at just one page of Histories of Time, you'll see Dung drawing on the theories about time from multiple different thinkers around the world. So it seems like over his different projects, one of the things that Dung Kai-cheung is doing is trying to fan out, as in 时间繁史, right? Fanning out the history of time in something of a V, so that we end up with this V city as a bit of a wedge in our consciousness and a wedge in history. And just to be clear, not all of Dung Kai-cheung's inspirations and touchstones are foreign or specifically Western. Dreams of the Splendor of the Eastern Capital, the Dongjing Menghua Lu, is a work that appears in several of Dung Kai-cheung's works as an inspiration. a way of thinking about memory of a city that is now gone. And Meng Hua Lu is even a title that Dung appended to one of his works, the Catalog. This is not just a title, this is also a way of reconstructing a lost place in exquisite and precise detail. Currently, 2 of Dung Kai-cheung's novels are available in English translation, as well as several shorter works. I would also highly recommend looking at these studies of Dung Kai-cheung's various literary projects. You can also hear from the author himself in several videos available online, including this one where he discusses how he writes, as well as this 2018 lecture at UBC, in which he gives extended remarks about how he invents Hong Kong stories, turning history into fiction.